Hi, I'm Buddy. I'm a software engineer. I work for a company called Convertro. We do marketing analytics. We're now part of AOL as of, it'll be a year in May. I'm a full stack engineer, I guess. I just like making things and will use whatever I can to make it happen. But I'm not here to talk to you guys about myself or my company. I'm here to talk to you guys about PhantomJS. If you don't know what it is, it's a headless web browser. That means a web browser you can run on a server. It's commonly used for things like unit testing. So you might want to run some unit tests or an integration test whenever you commit code. Maybe for screen scraping if you're using a website or a service that doesn't have an API. Or you could just use it for little things like taking a screenshot of a web page, like that web page, and that screenshot with this code. And that's really all it took. I'm sure everyone here can look at it and tell what's going on. You create a web page. You set the viewport size, so you tell how big you want the screen to be. Go to that URL, render it, which will save it to some location on disk, and peace out. And if the internet's playing well, we'll see this go. But we'll see. So these three buttons right here, what's actually happening is it's running that code using that version of the software and sending the results back. A little note, there's Phantom 1.9.8 and 2.0. 2.0 came out about a month ago, so everything I'm saying is about the same for 2.0. They don't have Linux binaries available, so you have to compile it for source. And there are a couple regressions. But for the most part, it's mostly the same. And it looks like it's not playing well. But if we try to run this in Node, oh, there it goes. Finally came back. But if we run in Node, it's just going to fail because the web page doesn't exist. Which kind of brings me to the first point. There's this really common misconception that Node and Phantom have something to do with each other at all. And they don't. Node is built using V8 and uses libuv for asynchronous I/O, and that's the majority of Node. Phantom, on the other hand, uses the Qt framework along with WebKit to really do the majority of its heavy lifting. If you don't know, Qt is an application framework. It's written in C++, and it's most commonly used for building desktop applications that are cross-platform. So you can write something that will run on Linux. It could run on OS X or Windows. And it gives you application framework kind of thing. So you have an event loop. You also have a UI toolkit, so you can have like menus and buttons and all that stuff. And the most important part is at least as far as PhantomJS is concerned, is it gives you a web view. So if you want to have a desktop application that has a web browser as part of the application, iTunes does this, Steam does this, there are a ton of applications that do this. So what the clever guys that built PhantomJS do is they realize they can take all these components, put them together, and just build a command line application. So I'm bringing this up because it ends up mattering a little bit because it's such a thin shim between the C++ side and the JavaScript side. There's a little bit of kind of an impedance mismatch that can get you in a little bit of trouble. So here's an example of what will happen if you try to access something that doesn't exist in JavaScript. It will produce an error that I'm sure everyone here has seen before. So we're just creating some object foo. It has some object bar that has some value baz, would delete bar, and then we try to access it. The runtime is going to throw up an error that you can do something with. And this is type error. I think we've all seen it. It's the same no matter what you're running. And that's different from what will happen in C. Yes, I'm showing C during a JavaScript talk. But basically what happening is GCC is a C compiler. We're telling it to read from standard in. we're creating a pointer that's pointing to nothing. It's not exactly the same as the previous side, but it's close enough. And you try to what's called dereferencing a pointer, where you try to do something with it. And what that does is it just crashes the program. You can't really recover from it. It just sig faults, and you're done. And the reason this can create a problem is you can have a use after free error really easily. So you can create an object in the JavaScript side, and that will create it on the Qt side in the application. You can then later do what's called closing, which is a little bit misleading. What it actually does is the next tick of the event loop, it will free out the memory, and it's gone. If you try to use it, you'll get a sig fault. But you still have a reference to it in the JavaScript side. So if you try to do something with it, it's going to sig fault. Last I checked, PhantomJS on the GitHub page had about 1,400 issues. Most of them are sig faults. So kind of the takeaway is, if you're going to be closing it, make sure that you're not going to use it anymore. And there's a little snippet down here, which is an extra kind of belts and suspenders. So if you navigate to about blank, what that will do is the web page instance, the WebKit instance, will cancel out all the network requests. It will stop execution of any JavaScript that's running inside the page, and it will be safe to close. And then if you run it, you will see, yep, it does nothing, just pieces out. Same thing with 2.0. So kind of that's it for the C. Like, there's not going to be any more C in this talk. So let's talk a little bit about the runtime when you're actually running it. So with 1.9, it's mostly ES5. You have a lot of the arrays have map and filter and reduce and all that you would expect. You have object create. But some things are missing. The one that always bites me is that function. The function prototype doesn't have bind. So you can't just bind some context. You kind of have to write your own or use underscore or something. And there are also little things like ParseInt, at least with the 1.9 series, doesn't have a radix by default. So if we try to run it, we'll see, yep, bind's undefined. 9 does not equal ParseInt of 0.9. But everything else is there. That's fixed in version 2 of Phantom. It seems to be fully ES5. With both versions, ES6 is basically non-existent, so you're dealing with ES5. And of course, with Node, this is going to do the same thing. Now let's talk about, so that's kind of the first thing I care about if I'm going to do something with JavaScript is, what version am I dealing with? The next thing I care about is how I'm going to share code between libraries. So there's kind of the 4 ways, the most common ways. There's the old school, just dumping libraries in a global scope. You have CommonJS, so if you use Node or Browserify or something like that, you use CommonJS. AMD, the required JS style, and the new ES6 modules that are coming out. So PhantomJS does CommonJS mostly. So this is Backbone's UMD. UMD is, if you don't know, is a universal module definition, so you can share code with whoever, if you're doing the global style or CommonJS or AMD. But the problem is this guy right here. And I don't mean to be picking on Backbone. A lot of different libraries do this. This is just the one I ran into. With Phantom, you have to require a file that's relative to the file that you're in. There's no way that you can do this underscore like that. You have to actually give it a path to underscore. But here in Backbone UMD, it's expecting there to be just something named underscore. So that's not going to work unless you do something tricky like overwrite the require function with your own that knows how to get it. So what do you do about this? It turns out there is another way. I may have lied to you guys. I'm sorry. There's another way. And that is with this InjectionJS. So what InjectJS does is it's really similar to like a pound include in C or a include or require in PHP or sourcing in Bash. It basically says, take this entire file and just put it as if it was right here on this one line. There's two things that will probably bite you when you're using InjectJS. You have to include an extension of what you're running. And instead of being relative to the file that you're in, it has to be relative to the entry point of the application. So if you have like main.js and then you have, lib foo or whatever, and you want to include it from foo, you have to include it as if you were in main. So what that does is, another side thing, this exports, that will, that's only defined in the require function. So by doing the InjectJS, exports undefined, so it will do the global style define. So what that lets you do is you can create this little shim and just include this file. Like if you want to include Backbone, you just include this file and it will do the right thing. And if I run it here, you'll see the constructor for underscore and the constructor for a Backbone view. And it works the same either way. The only thing that would be different, instead of exiting out of Phantom, you would just do the module exports, like you would assume. All right, so that's the next thing I care about, is sharing code. The last part that I really start caring about is testing. Since we're all writing unit tests, right, guys? So this is the world's most useless unit test. And there's this pattern with JavaScript testing frameworks. They seem to just dump variables in the global scope and just assume that they exist. And that can kind of end up being a problem. So before I found out that InjectJS trick, I came up with this overly complicated testing. Well, actually, the first version I did, I wrote my own testing framework. Don't do that. That's a really bad idea. It's so much easier to just figure out how to use something that exists. So what you do for that is you basically do the same sort of thing for the Backbone example. And most of this is just getting Jasmine set up. But you do the same InjectJS, so that way when everything's defined in the global scope up here, it's going to be in scope within the Jasmine file, the Jasmine test you're running. And again, Jasmine does this, but it's not specific to Jasmine. QUnit kind of does the same thing, where it dumps a bunch of variables. Mocha does it. In fact, the only ones I haven't seen do it have been like tape and tap, where they pass in the testing context. But with this, you're able to run the unit test for the Jasmine code, or excuse me, for the JavaScript code that you write that's separate from what runs inside a web page. So this lets you run your unit tests. And yeah, there's a whole lot more that I really want to talk about. The remote debugger port, that's a command line flag that you put for Phantom that will open up a web server. And you can go to that web server on that port on a WebKit-based browser, so Chrome or Safari or whatever else. It won't work with Firefox. But you'll have the WebKit inspector there, so you can go through your Phantom code through a debugger. What else? There's a web server module, which is really convenient for testing. There's actually something that I've wanted to do, but I didn't have time to do it with this talk. And you can create a web page, put a WebSocket in that web page, and have that WebSocket talk to some other process, so that way you can have communication back and forth. And there's a whole bunch of like really cool, awesome stuff you can do that I don't have time for. And yeah, that's it. Thanks, guys. So yeah, questions. What's up?
Try to close a page before going to about blank, and it's never gonna hang, or.
So this is more of a problem with earlier versions of Phantom. So 1.9.7, I ran into this, and what I think was happening is the web page still had JavaScript running and was still getting back requests from the server. But because it was free, it ended up crashing and creating a stake fault. So that's the potential downside. I think they fixed it with 1.9.8, so it's probably fine now. But it's just belts and suspenders. Anything else? What's up?
How much do you find yourself working in Phantom directly versus like making something else and then having like a thin layer in your actual Phantom code?
So do you mean like if you want to use something like Selenium to control it?
Yeah.
Okay, so they do have a Selenium driver. So if you didn't want to deal with it directly, you could just use Selenium and control it that way. In which case, it works just like any other web browser. What I ended up doing was just using Phantom directly. And that's how I ended up finding some of these bugs that I ran into. All right.
Cool.
All right, thank you.